Hello, and welcome back to the Ninox Learning Channel. My name is Andy. I'm a Ninox programmer and developer. And in this class, we're going to look at passwords and database security within the Ninox application development system. We're going to talk about how we protect our databases and the content inside of those tables. And we're also going to focus on building a system of rights and privileges and passwords and user identification techniques that enable us to make sure that people are able to see everything they need to execute their function and do their job, but do not see anything that they're not supposed to see. We're going to build a system inside of Ninox that allows us to guarantee that people who shouldn't be deleting data don't, that people who shouldn't be modifying data can't, but people can see the data they need to see. And if you are at a level where you are allowed to modify data or create data or delete existing content, we're going to build a security system that makes sure you can do that too. Security is tremendously important, whether you're building a database for your personal private use, or you're building a database that lots of people in your organization, or maybe people in other organizations, are going to be using. It's especially important if you're building a database that's going to be run on a computer that is being shared by many users. We don't just want to rely on the password protection of the computer itself. We want to make sure that we are locking down and protecting and securing the intellectual property and the intellectual asset that is the Ninox application and the data, information, and business intelligence that exists within that application. Now, for this particular class, we're going to be looking at the Nioxus ERP system. This is an application that we built that is an enterprise management system that has all of the major business functions that enterprises would use: accounting, financial reporting, general ledger and journal entry management, human resources and payroll, purchase orders and vendor management, order entry, invoicing, cash receipts, and customer management, and all sorts of equipment and maintenance and inventory tracking applications. Now, in this type of enterprise technology, while there may be one or two people that can see everything and do anything, most users are going to have some degree of restriction put on their password. Certain things you can see, certain things you can't see, certain things you can look at but not modify, other things that you can modify but not necessarily delete or duplicate. So we're going to use the Nioxus ERP system as the basis for this discussion on security, rights and privileges, and passwords. However, our discussion is going to begin outside of any particular application and here at the Ninox Cloud desktop. Now, we have created a Ninox Cloud room called the Nioxus Company. I have configured myself as the owner, and we're going to invite a few users to have access to this cloud room and the ERP system that exists within this cloud location. The very first thing that we need to do when creating our security protocols or creating that protective web or that protective coding around the Ninox app and the Ninox data within that application, the first thing we need to do is kind of draw up a picture, or at least a rough draft or an outline of what our security protocols and what that protective net is going to look like. Now remember, way back in the very beginning, 15 or 20 classes ago, when we were talking about getting started with Ninox, and we tried to answer that question, where do you begin? And the answer was, you begin at the end. You begin by defining what the solution looks like. You begin by defining the end state and then working backwards to create a tool, a database application that meets the needs, goals, and objectives of that end state. When building a security protocol or when defining your password system or your access and protection system. It's the same thing. Start at the end, define what the end state, the ultimate goal and objective of your security protocols, define what that goal is, and then work backwards using the tools available within Ninox to create a system that meets or hopefully even exceeds those goals, objectives, and requirements. So I'm going to leave Ninox just a moment and go take a look at our whiteboard. And there's a couple of topics that I want you to consider when you're preparing to build that protective coating, that security net around your Ninox application. First of all, how will we define a user? Is a user going to be defined specifically as an individual, or is it going to be a group? So for example, an individual might be me. The group might be the accounting department, or the inventory department, or the warehouse, or the payroll staff, or maybe our sales team. Now, groups are made up of individuals. In Ninox, you have the opportunity to do both, to define a specific individual and give that specific individual certain rights and privileges, or make that individual part of a group and assign rights and privileges to everyone who is in that group. But first we want to understand, how are we going to define, or we could even go on to say, how are we going to identify this concept or this construct of the user? The next thing that we want to think about when building our Ninox security protocols is, what is being protected? What is being protected? Are we specifically protecting the entire database, which is all of the tables and all of the data? Are we protecting certain tables? Are we protecting certain fields within tables? Are we protecting certain pieces of data or content within the fields? And again, there's no one answer, but we need to think about these things before we go in and start putting padlocks on this table and leaving this one open for everyone to see. We have to have a plan and a strategy. And our security plan and our protective strategy begins with, what is the goal and objective? We begin with defining the point and the purpose of the security system to begin with. What are the goals and objectives? For example, it might be to protect sensitive data from the wrong sets of eyes. This might be executive payroll or all of our payroll. It might be to secure the data asset. So we have to ask ourselves, who would be a threat to the security of the intellectual asset? And how do we make sure we have protected ourselves against that threat or peril? And then finally, we need to understand that this is about enabling process, not disabling. When we talk about security and protection, people very often take the perspective of doors you can't unlock, things you're not allowed to see, data that you can't touch. And while that's critically important, I encourage you to make sure you're looking at your security strategy from both sides. It's not just about what users can't see, can't touch, or can't do. It's about what they need to be able to do, the buttons they must be able to click, the code they must be able to execute, and the data, information, and intelligence they must be able to create, manage, enhance, report on, and maybe even ultimately delete. It's about what they need to do to be able to operate at maximum efficiency within their job. But all of this starts with, what are the goals and objectives of our security strategy? What is the point and purpose? Who are we protecting ourselves from? What are we protecting ourselves from? And how do we identify the people that should be able to use the system? And who are the threats that could imperil or compromise the technology or the content within the systems? And what is the best way to protect ourselves from them? The last thing I want to point out is Ninox has an absolutely world-class, military-grade protection and security set of features and functions. But no one system by itself makes up the entirety of a good, well-thought-out security strategy. A good, well-thought-out, and adequate, if not excellent, security system depends not only on software controls, such as the ones built into Ninox, but hardware controls, such as firewalls and just locking office doors, and operational controls, putting policies and procedures in place so we are able to protect the content, protect the asset. We are able to enable valid, rightful users, and we are able to quickly and permanently disable those who could cause harm or devalue the technology asset by getting into something they were not supposed to see. It's not just about setting up a password. So before you do anything, think it through. Now, having said that, let's look at how we actually build a security system. Let's look at how we create that protective coating, that protective armor that secures the Ninox content, that secures the data, the information, and the business intelligence that exists within that protective network. As I said, this all begins by identifying who are the users. And we identify them by inviting them to join us in a particular cloud room or in a specific location within the Ninox cloud environment. Now, it's important to understand that while Ninox does provide a desktop application for the iOS Apple environment, and while that application does include a number of the features and functions that we'll be discussing and demonstrating in this training video, we are going to be focusing on the cloud version of the Ninox application system. The cloud is where we have the most robust, the most flexible, and ultimately the most powerful protective devices at our disposal. It is the cloud version of Ninox that provides us the maximum degree of flexibility and protective capability in designing our systems. So let's begin by identifying our users. And we do that by inviting users to join our room. Here we've created this room in the cloud called the Nioxus company. This room contains one thing, this ERP application, this one database, which consists of many, many tables. Now, the first thing we have to do is tell Ninox who's allowed in the room. Who's allowed to even get into the facility that contains the technology asset itself? We do that by sending out invitations. Now, when sending out our invitations go out to users, and users are defined as team members. The name of this team is the Nioxus company. That's the name of this cloud room, or this cloud team. Anybody and everybody invited to join this team is a team member. And every team member must have a valid email address. Once you have defined the user by virtue of their address, their email address, We then define their rights and privileges. And there's a couple of different ways we can do this. By default, we can establish them as an editor or an administrator. Now, there is a third level of capability, which in fact is the highest level, and that is the owner. And as the creator of this team, I am the owner of this team. So I have the ultimate power to invite other team members. Now, as an administrator, a team member who has administrative rights has the ability to create other users, has the ability to grant them rights and privileges, has the ability to look at what's happening behind the curtain, look at the back-end code, look at the back-end data model, interface directly with the architectural construction and configuration of the Ninox application themselves. An editor, conversely, kind of functions in front of the curtain. They don't go behind the scenes and see the guts of our database. They can't add new fields to a table. They can't change the format from dollars to euros or yen to British pounds. They use the system as it was designed to be used in the manner for which it was intended. Administrators, they define how the system is to be used. They decide the manner in which the database is going to be used. And the owner decides who the administrators are. An owner can get rid of an administrator or reassign administrative rights. It does not go the other way. An administrator cannot replace the owner or remove the owner as the party in charge of a particular team or cloud room. So if we specifically define our user as an individual, then the individual is identified by virtue of a unique email address. Remember, unique email address. Do not, as a general rule, invite an email address team member where it's really 5 or 6 people sharing the same email. info@company.com is probably not a good email address to use to define and identify a team member. Keep it specific. One email address should identify and recognize one human team member who's going to access the system. And I specifically stated human team member. There are ways for Ninox to be accessed by other technologies, non-human operators, but in this class, we're focusing on the interface between Ninox and the human operators, the team members. When defining a unique individual, a human operator, we can set them as an administrator or an editor. We can uniquely identify them and give them rights and privileges and capabilities and access within the database, the tables, and the fields based on their specific, unique identification. The other option, you will remember, is to define groups, assign rights and privileges to the group, and then put individual team members into a group. And yes, one team member could be a member of multiple groups. Let's do that. Let's create some groups by going to the Access Rights dropdown. And again, I want to just point out that dropdown is only available when you click on the Invite function. We're going to invite new users or team members to our cloud room or our cloud team. And we're going to use the drop-down box to create new roles. Think of a role as a group. A group is a club. If you're a member of the club, you have all of the rights and privileges that any club member would receive. And if you're not a member, you have none of those rights and privileges. Let's create some new clubs or some new roles. Let's create one role called payroll clerk and another called warehouse operator. I'm going to create a couple of more teams. My accounts payable team, my accounts receivable team, and finally, my financial reporting team. And there we go. We just created 5 new groups. Well, we think we created 5 new groups. I just made a mistake that everyone makes when first setting up their protocols for security and password protection. Before you can define a group, and notice I've just gone back and hit the drop down for access rights, and none of those groups I just defined are visible because I didn't create them yet. You can only create a group by inviting a member into it. You cannot have a group with no members. So I'm going to invite some other members of the Nioxus team to join this group. We're going to start with Terry at Nioxus.com. And Terry is the payroll clerk. And I'm going to go ahead and send that invitation. An email has now been sent to this email address. When the email is accepted by the owner and controller of this email address, they will be members of this team. They can get into the room and they'll see that this database is available. Let's invite a couple of other people. Let's invite Leanne, and let's make Leanne part of our accounts payable team. Again, proper email address. It's not the name of the user, it is the email address of the user that defines them. Leanne at Nioxus.com. We will add Alyssa at Nioxus.com. Alyssa is also part of our accounts payable team. We'll send out that invitation. Finally, we will have Rob H at Nioxus.com. Rob is going to be in charge of the warehouse, so he is going to be the warehouse manager. We are also going to invite Chris at Nioxus.com. Chris is a warehouse operator. We will invite Annette, who also works in the warehouse as a warehouse operator. And we're going to create one more group. We're going to put Howard T, and it doesn't matter if you capitalize really. Howard T or Tenzin at Nioxus.com. And Howard is going to work in our finance and reporting group. And we'll go ahead and send that invitation. Now, one thing I encourage you to do, always have at least one user, and in this case, we will go with Lisa. Have at least one user who is an editor, and have at least one user who is an administrator. If the owner is not readily available, have a backup. Your administrator is your backup. And if the administrator isn't necessarily available, at least have an editor who's available to work with the rest of the members of the team. So every team has a coach, that's your owner. Every team has a captain, that is your administrator. And every captain has co-captains, those are your editors. Then you have all of the team members around that leadership group that execute their specific roles to ensure success of the operation. Now, As these invitations are received, the name of the members will appear up here under team members. The owner will always be listed on top, then the administrator, the editors, and the individual group members. As I pointed out, it is possible for someone to be a member of multiple groups. I might go here to Lori, who I set up as the administrator, and I'm going to want her, in fact, to be able to access everything. So I would, if I were doing this for real, cancel this invitation and resend it and make Lori part of every single group. So make sure you always have at least one admin who can access everything and at least one editor. And then if you have other multiple users, set them up either by virtue of an individual email or as members of a group. And finally, remember that individuals can be members of multiple groups. If I set up Ted might be in payroll, accounts payable, and sometimes manage the warehouse. So he's going to be a member of 3 different groups and have all of the rights and privileges that are assigned to all 3 of those groups. Here we are in the cloud room or the team room for the Nioxus team. Here are all the people who have been invited. Let's assume for purposes of this discussion they have accepted their invitation. And now let's go into the actual application, the asset that exists within this room. Now, there are lots of things that need to be secured in any and every database. But when we're talking about ERP and we're talking about accounting information, one of the first things that we want to secure is payroll. And in this system, payroll exists within the human resource management system. Now, here we have employee management. We have all of our individual employees. We haven't set any up, so we'll go ahead and look at one right now. Here's an employee management screen. This is where we define things like what department is the employee in, their address, their phone number, any related parties, who do we call in case of emergency, but most importantly, what is their hourly or annual salary, what is their gross pay, their withholding, their net wages, and anything else having to do with their compensation and benefit package. This, of course, is something that needs to be protected. So let's look at how we can do that. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go into the table management window for this particular table. This is the employee management table. And when working at the table level, keep in mind that everything you do with regards to rights and privileges, passwords and security, everything you do at the table level is going to apply to every field within the table. We'll see in a few moments how to be more specific and secure certain fields within the table. But let's start with table level security. The first thing we can do is simply define who can see it, who can change it, who can create new content within it, it being the table, and who can delete content that's already there. Since this is part of our human resource system, I'm going to say that only an administrator and only someone who is a payroll clerk is allowed to read or see this system. Only an administrator and a payroll clerk can create data or write content within this table. Only an administrator can create new records. Somebody in the payroll department, they can see the data that's there. Maybe they can even modify the data that's there, but they can't create new employees. Only an administrator can create a new employee. And similarly, only an administrator can delete a record or delete an employee. So here at a high level, at the table level, we have defined the groups, or in some cases, the single group that have the rights and privileges necessary to access all of this content, to see all of this content within this particular payroll or human resource or employee table. Now, This is group-based security. There is a group called administrator. In this case, it only has one member. There's a group called payroll clerks. Maybe there's 2 or 3 people that run payroll. So here we have basically said, if you are an editor or you work in the finance reporting division, or you work in the warehouse as a manager or an operator, or if you work in accounts payable or accounts receivable, or any of those other parts of our business, not only are you not going to be able to access this data, but because you can't read it, you won't even see this table. You won't know this table exists. Because the best way to secure something is to make it invisible. And that's what the read privileges do. The write privileges mean you can see it and modify what's already in it, it being the table. Create new means you can create new content within it. And delete means you can remove or eliminate legacy data that someone else, maybe you, maybe someone else, put into this particular table. That is group-specific rights and privileges, or that is group-specific security and protection. Now remember, we said there's 2 ways to identify a user: as a member of the group or as an individual. For this discussion, I want to return to our whiteboard. Remember, we talked about who is the user. Is a user an individual or a member of a group? Here, we selected and defined rights and privileges for users by virtue of their group membership. What if we want to be very, very specific? We not only want to identify a user by virtue of their email or their group membership, we want to specifically identify a very precise, explicitly named human operator as having certain rights and privileges. When the user is an individual, there are certain features and functions within Ninox that you're going to want to know how to use. The first one is this one, user ID. This gives us the ID, or the identification code, of the current user. Username, and again, that is capitalized, the N, is the name of the current user. I bet you can figure out what this one's going to be. That is the email of the current user. And then finally, what role does this user have? The role of the current user. And that might be something like admin, or editor, or payroll clerk. This one defines what groups they're a member of. So that one's not quite as important as these other 3. These other 3, the ones highlighted in yellow, these specifically identify a unique human operator by virtue of their identification code, the one they used when they were invited to the team room, their name, or their email. And again, these functions depend on each member of the team having a unique name and having a unique email. So when the user equals the individual, these are 3 functions we can use within Ninox to identify an individual. Now, in Ninox, we used group identification to define who could read and write, create or delete or eliminate content within the table. This was a group level of security definition. We also can be very specific using a code level of identification. For example, we could say that instead of defining an entire group of people that are allowed to read or write, that are allowed to create or delete, we could write something like this. User name equals Andrew Marks. This code, if you will, identifies a specific and unique user or member of the team. Similarly, this code identifies a specific and what should be a unique member of the team. By specifically identifying a single discrete individual, what we are saying with this line of code is, if you are not this person, then you are not going to be able to read this table. When we are doing specific identification of a user, we do that at a code level when assigning the ability to read or write to the database, to see it and to interact with its content. That is code-based, and that is specific user identification. You can do it by group for read, write, create new, and delete privileges. And when you do it at the table level, you are doing it, you are protecting, you are securing every element, every layout element, every field, every formula, and every table reference within this particular table. The next thing I want to look at is, how do we get a little more specific? Remember, this table contains lots of data. So we might want to go in and we might want to say that the administrator and the payroll clerk can read, and the administrator and payroll clerk can write content within this table. However, the one thing you cannot do if you are not the administrator is you can't see this particular field, the gross pay, or the net pay, or the estimated annual take-home pay. Here we want to assign field level security. Remember, table level security was applied to every piece of content, every field, every layout element, every reference that made up the data model for this table. Field level security allows us to get a little more specific. And field level security can be defined in 3 different ways. 2 of those ways are group-based. You can read if you are, for example, the administrator. You can write if you are the administrator. Or you can write if your username is this string. So here we're saying that anybody who is a payroll clerk can get this far. They can get into the table, they can see this screen. But only the admin can see and modify this specific field. And if we have more than one admin, only this particular admin, who also happens to be the owner. An owner by default is an administrator. Only this uniquely, specifically identified user is going to be able to interact with this field. So now we have said you can get into the ERP system. And if you're an administrator or a member of the payroll team, you can get into the employee management table. But only if you are an administrator, and only if you are a specific administrator, are you going to be able to access, to see, to interact with, or to modify the content of the payroll fields. So maybe as a member of the payroll team, you can enter time cards, you can change addresses, maybe you can update their job titles of their supervisor, but to interact with a coworker's payroll or compensation package, you not only have to be an admin, you have to be a very specific admin. But keep in mind, using all three levels is optional. I could simply say any administrator can see and interact with the payroll fields within this screen. You are not required to specifically identify one admin. So this allows us to fine-tune our security protocols. This many people can get into ERP. This many people can get into payroll. These two people can access that one field within payroll. And just to complete this conversation, we have put the ability to define users, define employees, and how much they get paid here within the Human Resource Management module. But the ability to assign employee benefits, to assign withholdings, and to actually process a paycheck, that's here in a completely different module. And this module has its own level of security, both table level, that is group-based, or potentially uniquely identifiable via code-based, and in addition, specific features. So to get into and actually run payroll, you would have to be able to not only get into this module, this table, and see particular fields, you'd also have to be able to get into this module, this table, and have access to a higher second level of fields. So we can build very complex security protocols around our Ninox databases at the table level, at the field level. We could even isolate it down to a specific user, and using the date, day of week, and time functions, we could be so specific as to say that you are only allowed to access a certain button or a certain field if you are a specific user and it is a specific time of a specific day. We could be so specific as to say that this button is only available on the second and last Friday of the month between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. and only if you are an administrator. Every other day of the week, every other time of the day, the button that we click to print paychecks, that button isn't even visible. So you can be specific down to a day of week, a day of the month, or a time of the day, in addition to a group of users or a specific user. That is table level and field level security. The last level of security that I want to show you is database level security. Remember we talked about our ability to go in front of or behind the curtain? If you're an administrator or an editor, you can go behind the curtain. You can see the guts of our database, the code, the data model, the formulas. Well, there's another level of security that allows us to define who sits in front of the curtain and uses the database the way it was designed to be used, and who can go behind the scenes and actually affect or modify or interact with the way the system is configured. If we are in administrative mode, which by the way means you're an administrator, and we go into options, there is this button that allows us to protect the database. Setting a password to protect the database means that the people who have the password can see the code, the data model, the formulas. And the people who don't have that password, and it doesn't matter what group you're a member of, if you don't have the database protection password, you cannot go behind the scenes. This is yet another level of security and protection that we can use. It is another form of digital armor that we can use to enclose, to secure, and protect the digital asset that is our Ninox database, our Ninox application, and all of the data content within that application. So we have this last tab that is security. The security tab allows us to define rights and privileges, again, at the database level. At the lowest level, we define security by field, by individual, unique, and specific user. Then we moved up a level and we defined rights and privileges at the table level, again, by group or by specific user. Now we've moved up to the highest level of security, the application or the database level. We're able to secure, by virtue of our protect this database password, who is restricted to being in front of the curtain and who can go behind the scenes. And using the security tab, we can define who can export or who can import data. Again, this is all done at the group level. We can indicate that some people can print things like paychecks, other people can't. We can indicate who can update queries or who can even open the database or see the history of interaction with the database. So remember, we first define the type of user we're going to be working with, an individual or a group of individuals. We assign rights and privileges to an individual or a group of individuals at a field level, which is the lowest level, at a table level, which is the intermediate level, and at the highest, most macro, the highest level, the database level itself. And that database level of security is accessed while in administrative mode using the security tab, or in addition, at your option, protecting the database with a password. So that is database security, passwords, rights, and privileges. It's not hard to do. Just remember, when inviting your users, to define the unique individual by virtue of their email, and optionally the group or multiple groups of which they're going to be a member. Then, once you access the database as an administrator, you assign certain rights and privileges to each of those uniquely identified users or team members and the groups that those team members are members of. We can assign group security at the table level to read, to write, to create, and to delete content. We also can specifically identify users, and remember these commands using the user ID, the username, the user email. These specifically identify individual discrete human operators. We can build that level of security at a code level here for the table, or we can go in to a specific field. For example, I might go into the account number field under more options and specify at a group level the ability to read or write, or at a code level specifically identify people who could write within these groups. And then finally, at the database level itself, while in administrative mode, we have the option to define who can go backstage behind the screen, who is merely an operator using the database application in the manner for which it was intended. And administrators, or people who have this password, they define the manner in which it was intended. And finally, the database, the application level security, which is group level security, that allows us to define who can open, see the history of, export or import the contents of, print or execute queries upon the contents of tables. One last thing, all database or application level security is group based. So if you only want to have one individual, for example, only one person can print data. That's your financial reports or your very sensitive payroll or inventory or purchasing or cash and bank reconciliations. If you want to assign that right and that privilege to only one user, create a group, make that one user the only member of the group, and then assign, for example, there's one member of the finance reporting group, and that is the only individual that is going to be able to print data out of any of the tables in this entire application. So you can be very specific. You can specifically identify a user at application database level security at that high level. You simply do it by creating a group of one. All right? So that takes care of security, rights, and privileges. It's a big topic. It's an important topic. But if you step back and start at the end, what are our goals? What are our objectives? What do people need to be able to do? What should they not be allowed to see? Who can get into the system and what can they do once they're in? And who could create problems and should never be allowed in the system? Or maybe they're allowed in the system, but they can only see certain tables or certain fields within a table. This ability to precisely identify users, assign them to groups, and then offer rights and privileges to the users or the group members at the highest level, the database level, or the table level, or the field level, allows you to define a security system, a security strategy, or as we call it, a digital coat of armor that protects and secures the Ninox digital asset and all of the data, information, and business intelligence that exists within that asset. That concludes our discussion in this class about rights and passwords, about security and user privileges. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned. And most importantly, I hope you will remember that building a database is great, but securing and protecting that database is crucial. So as you are building your database, think about who's going to be able to get into this table, who's going to be able to see what's in that field, who can add a new record, who can delete what's already there, who can see it but not touch it, who can interact with it but maybe not delete it or duplicate it. Think about how you're going to protect the asset as you are building and designing the asset. This will enable you to have extremely powerful, extremely capable and robust and technologically sophisticated Ninox applications that are secure and protected and safe from any digital or operational threat. I hope you enjoyed this class, and I hope you'll join us in our next class when we're going to be going back to views and looking at how we can visualize data, how we can draw charts and graphs and pictures, if you will, pictures of content, bar charts and pie charts and histograms and heat maps. In our next class, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, we're going to learn how to draw very valuable pictures here in the Ninox database system. Thanks for joining me. Go out and build some great databases and join us in our next class. Thanks for being part of the Ninox community. Thanks for joining us here on the Ninox Learning Channel, and I hope to see you in our next class very, very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody.